Iran is one of the world's most ancient civilizations. They were known as the Persians in the West for most of their history. They had great and powerful empires throughout the ancient and medieval world. But modern Iran, as we know it, took shape in the 18th century when the Qajar dynasty came to power in 1789 and established what became known as the Sublime State of Iran. The Qajars were an Iranian royal family of Oghuz Turkic origin. Their rule saw moments of progress as well as decline. They opened new connections with the West and introduced early steps towards modernization. For example, one of their rulers, Nasr al-Din Shah Qajar, he was the first Iranian to ever be photographed and one of the first monarchs in the Middle East as well to be photographed. And he had a huge interest in photography and it became sort of a hobby of his. But despite these modern touches, the Qajars were often seen as out of touch with the people and lacked strong leadership. Iran continued to develop through the 19th and 20th centuries, but during World War I, they were in a very dangerous position. Iran was squeezed between the Russian Empire from the north, the British from the southeast, and the Ottoman Empire from the west. Even though they wanted to remain neutral, Iran ended up being a battleground for these three major powers, especially because the British had a lot of oil fields in Iran which fueled the Royal Navy. The Qajar government was too weak to stop them invading, and the result was devastating. Over 2 million Persian civilians died, largely due to the Persian famine in 1917 and the ripple effects of the Armenian genocide which was carried out by the Ottomans. There was widespread dissatisfaction with the Qajar rule, and it reached a breaking point in 1921 when Reza Khan, a brigadier general in the Persian Cossack Brigade, led a British-backed coup that eventually ended Qajar control and set the stage for a new era in Iranian history. In 1925, the former military commander was installed as the new king. His name was Reza Shah, and at the time, last names weren't a common thing in Iran. So Reza Shah needed to adopt a family name. He chose the name Pahlavi, and this was deliberate because Pahlavi means Parthian in Old Persian. So he was connecting himself with the ancient history of Persia, a time when Persia was a global power. He wanted to resurrect the idea of a strong and powerful Persia. The British supported Reza Shah's rise to power because they wanted a strong pro-British ally in the region who could bring stability to Iran and protect British interests, especially oil. In the 1930s, Reza Shah became somewhat of an admirer of Hitler and Nazi Germany. Not because he fully supported their ideology, but because he saw parallels between their paths to power. Like Hitler, Reza Shah had risen from a modest background to become the leader of a nation. He also admired German engineering and technology, and it was something that he wanted to implement into his own country. So as World War II progressed, Iran again stayed neutral. But when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Britain urgently needed to secure a route to send weapons and supplies to help its new Soviet ally. Iran's railway system seemed like the best route, but the British were concerned about the strong German presence and influence in Iran under Reza Shah, so they were afraid of some kind of sabotage or some kind of resistance. Because of that, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran on August 25, 1941. The attack caught the Iranians off guard, and their forces were quickly overwhelmed. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate the throne, and in September, his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became the new monarch. Initially, the British considered bringing the Qajars back, but public opinion in Iran was so strong in favor of the Pahlavis, and as a result, the British accepted Mohammad Reza Shah a little reluctantly, but with the new leadership in place, they were able to secure the railway and the supply route they needed. It became known as the Persian Corridor, and it became a crucial lifeline for transporting weapons and aid to the Soviets throughout the war. The father, Reza Shah, he was exiled to Mauritius by the British, and from there he would then move to Johannesburg, where he would spend the rest of his life and die in South Africa. After World War II, tensions rose between Iran and the Soviet Union, who had occupied the northern regions like Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, regions of Iran. With Soviet support, local communist movements gained power. But in 1946, the Soviet troops withdrew, and the Iranian army moved in to dismantle these Soviet-backed governments. The Shah loved flying. He was a qualified pilot, and he knew all the technical details of airplanes.
In the USA is the Shah of Iran, whose visit to the American aircraft carrier Valley Forge reflected his interest in all types of aviation. A qualified pilot himself, the Shah was able to show his skill at the controls of a Navy plane on the homeward trip.
He strongly favored the Air Force so much that he began to direct huge sums of money to the Imperial Iranian Air Force and bought a lot of planes from Britain and the US. His first marriage was to an Egyptian princess, the daughter of King Fuad I of Egypt. They had a daughter together, but the marriage didn't last. It wasn't a happy one. The Shah had built a reputation for being a bit of a ladies' man. And after he divorced his first wife, he spent a lot of time going out to nightclubs in Italy, France, and London, jet-setting the world and living the high life. And he dated many famous actresses of the time, including Jean Tierney, Yvonne De Carlo, and Silvana Mangiano. Living the way he did, it wasn't long before someone tried to assassinate him. On February 4th, 1949, during a ceremony at Tehran University, a gunman fired 5 shots at close range, grazing the Shah's cheek. The attacker was immediately killed by security forces. They initially accused the communists of being responsible for this assassination attempt from the party called the Tudeh Party, which they banned afterwards. They also found the gunman had links to the Shia radical group called Fadayan-e-Islam. The communists were nonetheless blamed and persecuted. The Shah was already suspicious of communism, and after this moment, he would really go to great lengths to prevent the spread of communism in Iran. In the 1950s, the real power in Iran wasn't the government. It was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which controlled Iran's vast oil reserves. Britain held a 51% stake in the company since 1914, and it was extremely profitable for the British. In 1954, the company was renamed the British Petroleum Company, also known as BP. Britain was making huge profits, but a lot of Iranian people felt this was unfair. That's when Mohammad Mossadegh came in. He was a fiercely nationalist and pro-Iranian politician. He became prime minister and convinced parliament in Iran to nationalize the oil industry for the Iranian people. He pushed for a constitutional monarchy where the king was more symbolic, similar to how things are in the UK. And of course, the Shah also wasn't too happy about this, but he couldn't resist it openly without looking tyrannical in the eyes of the people. Britain then turned to the United States for help. They framed it as a risk for communist takeover in Iran, which was all they needed to say to the US really to get them involved. This is how Operation Ajax was born. It was a combined CIA and MI6 initiative to remove Mossadegh from power and strengthen the Shah as a pro-Western ruler. The operation was led on the ground by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a senior CIA officer, and they basically bribed a bunch of Iranian army officials to stage the coup. The Shah was also in on the plot and received a bribe himself of $1 million in cash for his support. The coup happened on the 16th of August, 1953. But the coup didn't go as planned. Mossadegh was tipped off and the element of surprise was gone. The Shah quickly fled to Iraq and then to Rome for his own safety. But the CIA didn't stop there. After the first failed coup, the CIA shifted their strategy. Instead of relying on military officers to arrest Mossadegh, they focused on manipulating public opinion and creating mass unrest. And they began to funnel large sums of money to influence Iranian newspapers, stage protests, and hire street mobs to stir chaos in Tehran. The goal was to make it look like Mossadegh had lost control of the country. As tensions escalated, various groups from communists to conservatives, they all joined in the unrest for their own reasons. Some people supported Mossadegh, others backed the Shah, but the streets of Tehran descended into violence. On August 19, 1953, the CIA's efforts paid off. Crowds flooded the capital, many of them organized or paid by the CIA, clashed with Mossadegh supporters in street battles. By the afternoon, pro-Shah forces stormed government buildings and Mossadegh's residence. His guards abandoned their posts and Mossadegh surrendered. He was later put on trial and sentenced to house arrest, where he would remain for the rest of his life. With Mossadegh removed, General Zahedi was installed as the new prime minister, and the Shah returned from exile within a few days, now ruling with full backing from the West. Then the question came about who would control Iran's oil. The US and Britain struck a new deal to reopen Iranian oil under a new consortium nicknamed the Seven Sisters. It was made up of the 7 largest Western oil companies that dominated the global oil industry at the time. 4 were American: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Gulf. The rest were BP, Shell, and Total. And together, these oil companies controlled about 85% of the world's oil reserves. Iran was promised 50% of the profits, but it had no control over pricing, production, or exports. Western companies were still in charge of Iranian oil. The US pushed for this arrangement not just for its reward in the coup, but to help make sure Britain never had a monopoly over Iranian oil again. For the West, it was a win. The oil was flowing and profits were soaring. But for many Iranians, it was just another betrayal. This deal and the way it was imposed, it deepened public resentment toward both the Shah and the West. And this is when some Muslim clerics became more prominent voices in the country. In 1959, the Shah officially recognized the State of Israel, which was a highly controversial move for a Middle Eastern country at the time. His relationship with US President John F. Kennedy was also tense. The Shah feared Kennedy was planning to remove him from power. By the early 1960s, Ayatollah Khomeini had become the leading Shia religious figure in Iran. In 1963, he openly clashed with the Shah over the White Revolution, a new sweeping reform program introduced by the Shah that included land redistribution, nationalization of forests, privatization of state industries, women's right to vote, and political rights for religious minorities. Khomeini denounced the reforms as anti-Islamic, claiming they allowed Christians, Jews, and the enemies of Islam to influence the law and society. He also accused the Shah of being a puppet of the US and Israel. Riots erupted across the country. Around 400 people were killed, and Khomeini was arrested and exiled, spending the next 14 years in Turkey, Iraq, and later living in France. In April of 1965, the Shah narrowly survived another assassination attempt at the Marble Palace, foiled by his imperial guard. Despite rising unrest, he pushed ahead with his agenda. He married for a 3rd time and indulged in his collection of luxury cars and planes. And in 1967, he even elevated himself from Shah, which was basically a king, to Shahanshah, the term for emperor. He was a passionate admirer of ancient Persian history, and he staged many grand celebrations to promote his legacy and the imperial past of Iran. For example, in 1971, he held a massive ceremony at the ancient Persian capital of Persepolis. He invited 60 royals and leaders from around the world. Even Prince Philip, the husband of the Queen, was there. He wanted to promote Iranian history and culture around the world and connect the modern nation with its ancient past. It was meant to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. And he had a parade where soldiers dressed up as ancient Persian immortals and wore uniforms of all the Persian dynasties throughout history, from Cyrus the Great's time, the Sassanids, medieval Persia, all the way up to modern times. It was quite a spectacle, and he also built a new monument in Tehran that was designed to look like a Zoroastrian fire altar, which you can still see today in Tehran. His whole mission was to promote the ancient Iranian culture and identity more. And at the same time, he did modernize Iran a lot and improve many aspects of Iranian life. He redirected oil profits into education and new building projects, and transformed Tehran into one of the most modern cities in the region. In the 60s and 70s, women were also much more involved in society. They were encouraged to get into education, and a lot of women became judges and even held political positions. He also made Iran a tolerant place for the Jewish minority, whom there were around 80 to 100,000 living there at the time. Under the Shah, Iran's economy was growing at a remarkably fast pace throughout the 1960s and 70s. By the late 70s, it had become the 18th largest economy in the world, even ahead of countries like South Korea. They had massive oil revenues, and this fueled industrial growth, and foreign companies were investing heavily in Iran. Jobs were plentiful, cities were expanding, and for many Iranians, especially in urban areas, the living standards rose sharply, with better access to education, healthcare, and modern infrastructure. In 1973, the Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War triggered a major global energy crisis. Arab oil-producing countries, led by Saudi Arabia, cut off oil exports to the US and its allies to punish them for supporting Israel. This caused oil prices to quadruple almost overnight, leading to a fuel shortage and crisis in the West. Iran, under the Shah, didn't join the Arab oil embargo. Instead, he continued selling oil at the newly inflated prices and made a fortune. The Shah used that wealth not only to fund rapid development at home, but also to project Iran's power abroad. In a bold move, he loaned $1 billion to France and the UK each, partly to support their struggling economies during the crisis, but also to make a statement. By the late 1970s, the Shah was losing support both at home and abroad. Opposition, especially from Ayatollah Khomeini's supporters, was still alive and quietly building strength in the country. In October 1977, protests began to break out across the country. By that time, the Shah had already been diagnosed with leukemia and was frequently abroad for treatment. As his health declined, so did his grip on power. Court officials struggled to get clear decisions from him, and the revolution gained momentum. In 1978, the Shah was visibly weaker and he couldn't make decisions. And the army began to violently crack down on demonstrations and ended up killing civilians, which further fueled public anger. The revolution had a very broad support base, from Islamic groups to secular people to far-left nationalists. And Khomeini presented himself as a moderate to unify all these groups. On November 5th, 1978, the Shah appeared on TV, promising reforms. He released political prisoners and tried to appease the revolutionaries. But this only emboldened his opposition and upset those who were loyal to him. Even some of his own generals began quietly turning against him. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran for what he claimed was medical treatment, but it was, in truth, permanent exile. Within hours, statues of him were torn down, and his regime collapsed almost overnight. In early February, the monarchy was swept away, and by March 31st, Khomeini held a national referendum. Over 98% of people voted to abolish the monarchy and establish an Islamic republic. Khomeini became supreme leader, and Iran was transformed from that moment. In the months that followed, Iran's relationship with the US deteriorated, and by 1980, it was at war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Meanwhile, the Shah fled to Egypt. From there, he went to Morocco, then the Bahamas, Mexico, and finally, President Jimmy Carter allowed the Shah to enter the United States for cancer treatment. The decision of letting the Shah into the US further enraged the new Iranian regime, worsening an already collapsing relationship. The Shah eventually returned to Egypt, where he would die on July 27, 1980, at the age of 60. He was given a state funeral by the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. His son, Reza Pahlavi, remains the head of the Pahlavi Dynasty and he's currently in exile today. Thank you for watching. If you liked that video, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.